This is the Awful Announcing Podcast. Here's your host, Brandon Contes.
Alrighty, welcome to episode 50 of the Awful Announcing Podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Contes, and this week we have Indianapolis 500 legend Paul Page joining us. Paul, thanks so much for coming on the podcast today. A broadcasting career that spans over a half century. You were the voice of the Indianapolis 500. Where are you going to be for the race this Sunday? Are you at the track? Are you working? Are you just a spectator?
I'm at the. By the way, hi. Good to see you guys. I am at the track. I will work with the Indianapolis Motor Speedway radio network, which I have for. Well, I started as a play-by-play guy, host play-by-play with them in 1977. And then in '89, I moved over to ABC, and then they went to NBC, and I'm back on the radio network, and I'm kind of the voice of the 500 emeritus. That means I'm the old guy that sits in the back of the booth, and I can occasionally turn my own mic on. So that's where I'll be. I'll be up in the broadcast booth. That was a long way getting there, wasn't it?
No, great answer. Where is the best place to watch the race? Is it from the booth? Is it from the pit, the crowd?
Well, the booth, no. Too busy, too many monitors sitting up in front of us, if they kind of block your view. And the booth is actually in the corner of the media center. And so there is a row of grandstand right level with the booth. And when they stand up to cheer, we couldn't see the track. We had all the monitors. Best place to watch it is turn one, grandstand E, up under the shade a little bit. That's where I like. That's where I sat before I got the job.
And when was the last time that you weren't working the race?
1973.
1973. That's
50 years actually of radio network broadcast.
Yeah. How did you get into broadcasting? Is it something that you grew up wanting to do?
Yeah, it really is. When I was in high school, I went to high school in the North Shore of Chicago at Highland Park. And in the senior year, they had a broadcasting deal to go to the local station in Waukegan, Illinois. And that was on Saturday, and it was for the Suburban High School News Network. And so guys from every school. And I really got into it. I kind of hit it off with the engineers. I learned how to run a board, learned how to cue things up, so I really liked it. So I went to the University of Tulsa to their school of broadcasting, and I did really, really well for 1 year. I didn't do that well, so I was my draft board notified me that I was 1A, so I joined the Army. But I would come to Indy any chance I got, because my basic love was the Indy 500. That's any kind of broadcasting that got me there. That was the way that we really wanted to do it. So I ended up doing news at WIBC in Indianapolis, which is where Sid Collins, the guy who invented the Indianapolis Motor Speedway radio network, was, and he took a liking to me, and he started training me to take over as the host someday. And in 1977, he passed away on May 2nd. It was 3 weeks before the race, and it was sudden. So 1977, I was suddenly the host play-by-play, and I guess you could say the rest is history. I've had an incredible life. I really have. Broadcasting has brought me so much.
How many years were you in the Army for before you were
6.
able to really start your career?
6 years. 6.
And did you grow up a racing fan?
Well, actually, that's a great question. We were a military family, and so our family traveled with my dad, who was a lieutenant colonel, and we were stationed in Germany. And I had an uncle in Indianapolis who I'd really bonded with. He was a great guy, and he told me when we moved to Fort Sheridan, Illinois, north of Chicago, he wrote and said, we want Paul to come down and see the Indy 500. Well, I've seen a Formula One race at the Nürburgring. So my answer was, wait a minute, I don't want to see guys turn left 800 times. I'm, Formula One and all that. And the answer to that argument was, you're going. And I went, and we were sitting pretty much in the area I just described to you, turn one, looking down the main straightaway. The race hadn't started. The official ceremonies had. And those ceremonies alone knocked me over. And I said at that time, I got to do something involved with this race. Maybe I could be a broadcaster. And so Sid took me under his wing, and in '77 I started doing that. And in '89 I moved over to ABC Sports. In 2004 I moved back to the radio network, and I actually did play-by-play for 2014 and 15. And at the 100th race, I started the race, did the play-by-play call to start it, and then handed it off to Mark Janes to be the new voice. So,
Did you do any broadcasting while you were in the Army?
yeah, actually, I attended the Defense Information School, which taught Army broadcasters for the American Forces Radio Network, and that I actually taught a lot. The military is good at teaching you a lot of stuff in a very short period of time, and so I use a lot of what the military taught me back then.
I have to ask you about the helicopter crash, which you discuss in your book, Hello, I'm Paul Page. It's race day in Indianapolis. You were in the helicopter doing local traffic reports at the time?
Yeah, I was doing traffic and news, and we didn't really have any traffic at that time in Indianapolis. So what I really was the straight guy for the morning and afternoon drive DJ. And we also, though, we did hard news. You know, it's big wreck on the interstate. We would land, we'd get all the info. And on December 1st of 1977, we were crossing over the top of the speedway, and we heard a very loud crack somewhere above us. And we were on our way to the airport. We were just destined to head for Indianapolis International. And that loud crack was the main rotor system stopping in the air. So when that stops, you don't have any auto rotation. And so we were a homesick brick for 500 feet all the way to the ground. I thought we were going to hit the Speedway High School. We instead hit the football field, and that helped the crash, if you can say something that thing. I was thrown out of the helicopter, severely broke my leg. I'm amnesic to the actual impact, but I know everything that happened immediately after, because when memory comes back, there's still parts hitting around me. So helicopters are 10,000 parts flying in loose formation. Did you know that?
I did not. How vivid are those the memories of before and after the crash?
They're pretty vivid,
Yeah.
but they're not. They didn't destroy me mentally.
Yeah.
And matter of fact, any chance I get, I'm getting in an airplane. I mean, since that time, I've landed on aircraft carriers, and it's all in the book. But yeah, I love airplanes. So.
Have you flown in a helicopter again?
Oh yeah, yeah. A lot of times actually. It was a very good way to leave racetracks sometimes, just to get the helicopter. They have a group, you know, all would rent a helicopter, and we'd all leave the track and head for the airport so we could get home earlier.
What was that first helicopter ride like after the
Well,
crash?
the first one I took was with the new WIBC helicopter, a lot nicer helicopter, I might also say. I didn't get the nice one. And so they said, "You want to come up?" I said, "Sure," and we had a good time. I actually did a traffic report.
What about the day of the crash? Did you do a report before the crash? Was that?
Yeah, and that's another good question. I had done a report. It was the second to last report of the day, and after I gave that, that's when we always turned for the airport. And so the crash happened. Now, my communications with the station was actually a walkie-talkie. Well, when we crashed, the walkie-talkie, the headphone and everything ripped loose. So the walkie-talkie's laying on the ground, but it's still active. And I can hear the DJ calling, says, "Come on, Paige, we're on the air. Where are you? Get going. Come on." You know, I'm not talking to you. There was about 10 feet somewhere. I wasn't going to crawl over there. It
Yeah,
would
of
have,
course.
in retrospect, that probably would have been neat.
Yeah, definitely would have been.
And my leg was, there's a little too much issues there.
No, that's still an incredible story.
Yeah, thank you.
You mentioned your relationship with Sid Collins before. What was it about Sid that made him willing to become your mentor? Like, what was it about your relationship that you guys were able to connect?
Well, I worked in studio on the night shift, meaning that I took over at 6 o'clock. And Sid was the sports director at WIBC at the time. So like at 6:15, he had a 15 to 20 minute sports program. And so after the sports program, we just sit and talk. And we hit it off. We became very close friends almost immediately. And so we started hanging together and going places. And he would take me into the studio. One day I was doing the coverage for the Soapbox Derby over on Wilbershaw Hill here in Indy. And I did an interview with the winner, and I sent it back to the station, and they put it on the air. And I drove back to the station, and as I walk in, Sid is standing in the middle of the lobby with his arms folded. And he said, "That is the worst interview I've ever heard." I said, "Okay, well, I know where my career is going." But then he took me back in the studio, and we started working on interviews. And he was such a perfectionist, it probably took us a full week just for him to get all the information on how to do an interview through. Sid was a perfectionist, but he was also a lot of fun. Most people don't see him as a guy with a sense of humor, but we had a lot of good times together.
How many years about did you work with him?
I worked with him from 1973 until 1977.
And I don't know how comfortable you are talking about his death, but how hard was it, because you mentioned that his death was sudden, how hard was it succeeding him as chief announcer under those circumstances?
It was, and I don't mind talking about it. He committed suicide on May 2nd of that year. He did because he had amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS, and he was afraid of it. He didn't have a family. He had just like three of us that he hung with. And so he didn't have any emotional support. And we talked to a psychiatrist, what are we going to do about this? And he said, there's only one thing you can do, and that is if he talks about it, you talk about it with him. So if he says, I'm going to shoot myself, then we were supposed to say, well, if you do that, Sid, it's going to look ugly, and you're a good-looking guy. And he would do that. He'd talk with us over the methods, and maybe 3 or 4 times. But he never discussed hanging, which is how he killed himself. He hung himself from a clothes bar in his bedroom closet. And we were arriving, his lawyer and I were arriving to try to take him and get him some into where he would get constant medical care. And when we walked in, his cane was hanging on the banister, and we ran upstairs, and there he was. He had killed himself.
So you actually found him?
Yes, yes. So the radio network's annual breakfast was the next morning, and we had right at 3 weeks to prepare. He and I had originally planned that he was going to start that race, the 77 race, and he'd give it to me at halfway, and I'd finish that race. And we were kind of excited about doing it, but he got this diagnosis like in the middle of April. So it was a very short time until he decided he didn't want to endure that.
How hard was that first broadcast after he had died? What were those emotions like?
Well, stage fright beyond belief, and that was something that I really hadn't felt for a long time because, being a pro, I was just used to working. Mike's on, I talk. But boy, that morning I just overloaded with stage fright, and my brain's going through, what do I do with this? What did Sid say about that? Just back and forth and back and forth. My brain's doing all these things. And I finally get up into the booth. I waited until a little later than I probably should have, but I just wanted to kind of be alone and look at the crowd and stuff like that. So when I went up to the booth, we got all prepared. Freddie Agavation, the driver expert, was there, and the producer of the show, who would stand next to me on my right rear, um, about 30 seconds to go, he leans over and he shakes my hand and he says, "Paul, there are 3 million people out there listening to you. Don't screw it up." Well, that was enough of a relief that when we hit the up on the clock, I took off and we did it. I wasn't on right away because they had one of the other announcers deal with the whole Sid situation so the audience would understand.
Yeah, somebody had spoke about
Right.
his death.
Right.
Was that the hardest broadcast that you ever did? Whether
Oh, by far.
Yeah.
By far. Well, and for any number of reasons. One is I fully understood that might be my only broadcast.
Yeah.
I was stuck in there because they didn't have anybody else. But now when it was over, they'd have a year. And since we're broadcasters, I'll reveal something that no one's ever asked me this. It's like the question would be, what was the first race you ever called play-by-play on? And the answer would be the 1977 Indianapolis 500. So if you're going into it, go with both feet,
Yeah. Yeah. Was there what was the feeling like after that first race, following Sid's death?
Relief.
Sense of relief.
Donald Davidson, Fred Agavation, my producer, were in the booth at the time. I shook their hands and thanked them, and they left. They were off to other celebrations and things, and I just sat down, and it all kind of it drained out of me. But I sat there with a little smile because I may not have been the greatest play-by-play in the world, but I got through it without embarrassing myself. So I was calmed down. All the weight was off my shoulders, and so I would just wait and see. And later in that year, Mr. Holman approached me. We were out at the state fairgrounds where they had a race called the Hoosier 100. And he came up and he said, "You did a wonderful job. We'd like you to do it from now on." So that was the final piece.
That was when you became became the permanent replacement.
Right. And then I stayed there. I worked for NBC Sports at the same time on NBC Sports World. And then in 1987, they weren't very happy with the new live television. It had been on for 2 years. And ABC felt like they needed a play-by-play guy who did auto racing and understood it. And of course, I had network television experience for 10 years. I did all the kart series for NBC. And so I was ready to do live television of the 500, and the Speedway wanted me to. I didn't want to ask them. I just, whatever you guys were working out. And they finally came and they said, we need you to go to work for television because at least you can call the race in a way that's understandable to race fans.
How different were you of a broadcaster from Sid? Were you able to develop your own style, being that Sid was your mentor, and then you were kind of thrown into replacing him?
Yeah, well, I wasn't nearly as dignified as Sid was on the air. He had a pace and a manner about him, and he would fold things into the broadcast, like reading telegrams that have come in and things like that, in a very skillful way. As a broadcaster, he was very, very skillful. The one thing that had bothered me when I worked in the pits was that when a caution came out, the way the system worked in the booth was the turn would call in to the booth, to the producer's line in the booth, and say, "I've got something." And then the producer would then write turn 2 and whatever he said it was and hand that to Sid. Well, that was a long delay.
Yeah.
So in television with NBC, I'd learned and worked pretty successfully with the IFB, where they're talking in your ear while you're talking on the air. So we set up a system that year for essentially an IFB for all of the announcers. So I could push a button and take my mic off the air, and I could say, turn one, let's do this or this. Or turn one and turn two could say, turn two, yellow, and we'd be right there. I just hand it over as quick as I could. So in essence, we brought it into real and current time.
So that was a change that you came up with, that idea to make that change?
Yeah, I did that. It worked in television. I thought, let's try it in radio. And they still use it today,
Yeah.
so it must have been okay.
Did you have a preference calling races on radio versus television?
Radio by far. In television, you have a truck with a bunch of monitors, in our case usually as many as 40, and a producer who is probably coming from New York and has spent most of his life riding in a yellow cab. He's now in control of the race. And you should hear some of the go back and forth when I'd hit my button to take me off the air and tell the producer, the TV producer, let's go to this, let's go to that, these are happening. And that got to be some interesting arguments. But so there, the truck was controlling the race, and that was based on their view of what the video needed to be. And they were very afraid of going off the leader for fear that he might crash while they were looking at something else. So they would ride with the leader quite a bit. Radio, it's theater of the mind. I can paint that picture for you. I as the anchor, I control the pace of the race and how it's going to be done throughout the broadcast. And so me being the boss, that was a lot easier. But what was easier was that you could paint those word pictures, and I just love doing that.
So what were you looking at as a radio broadcaster? Like what part of the track are you looking at, and then do you have monitors in front of you that you're watching as well?
Well, at first, no, we did not. And we also the Speedway didn't have computer scoring for almost 5 years, I think it was. And we didn't have a booth monitor. We later got ABC to give us a program line feed, but I had to count on what the guys saw on the turns and them getting the information in. And as a team, they were awesome.
Yeah.
You hear those guys work, and it's everything is in such a way that it's not mechanical. I don't have to say, let's go to turn one. One of the things Sid taught me, don't have all the guys with the same broadcasting voice, so you want it different so the audience knows. And that was just so smooth and so great at that time. And also they were all locals with the exception of Gary Gerald, and so they knew the 500 inside out, and they understood and felt the tradition. So it was the greatest team ever.
And what about those back and forths with the TV producer? Was that based on stuff that you saw yourself, or is that based on things that people were kind of feeding to you and reporting to you in your ear?
It was based on things that I saw. Because their monitors, they may have all the cameras to look at, but I'm looking out the window and I'm feeling the rhythm of the race.
Yeah.
I'm on the center of the main straightaway. They're going past me at 220 plus, but there's a rhythm, and I can see them, and I can feel the differences, and I feel a battle going on for tenths, something like that, and that's what I would tell the producer. Let's go here, let's go there, and more often than not, they hesitated. In fact, one of the great writers of motorsports, a guy named Robin Miller, who has passed away, but was a brilliant motorsports writer. He and I were good friends before I got into these jobs. He wrote for the Indianapolis Star at the time. And when I started at ABC, I was like the face of ABC from his point of view. And so everything that was wrong was my fault. And, okay, that's his job, and I'm doing my job. Well, he went to work for NBC to work with them on their live telecast of Indy and the other races when they took over. And he had done like 4 or 5 shows, And he came to me. We were standing back in the garage area of the Speedway. He said, "Hey, Paige, come here." And he went into this profuse apology. He said, "Now that I've seen it work, I understand you couldn't do anything with those guys to make it work."
So did you have a TV producer that you were ever really in sync with?
Yeah, I did. I had several. Bob Goodrich, who came to us as primarily a football guy. Um, and I had Debbie Lugenbuehl, who was at all of the races, not just Indy, because we did the whole season. So she was always there as a producer, and she really understood racing well. And she ended up marrying Dan Lugenbuehl, who was Penske's vice president of communications. So those two especially. Um, yeah, that would be it. There were a number of others, not at Indy, but at the other races of the year, we'd change up from time to time.
Were there changes that you made or ideas that you had to bring to the TV broadcast similar to the way you
Yeah,
do with radio?
I saved them money and I never got a percentage of it. Um, when I came there, the way they were so afraid of doing live that they were just overproducing everything. And one of the things they had was an entire remote unit, entire semi devoted to the bumps going to commercial, coming out of commercial, and having beauty shots as needed. And they also were the truck that handled the pre-race. And I'm saying, what are you doing? Why do you can do this with one truck? And we went back and forth, and in the second year, they tried it. They had another truck sitting there, but
Just in case.
they did it, and they said, wow, now we don't have to bring that other truck. Yeah, good idea. Great thinking.
What about the Delta Force intros? Those still seem to resonate with racing fans. Whose idea was that?
Those were amazing. John Ohlmeyer, he had been the executive producer at NBC Sports when I was there. Prior to that, he had executive producer roles at ABC Sports in the day when ABC was it. And so he was the one that hired me at NBC. And where are we going with this? I'm
Delta Force intros.
Oh, thank you, sir. Thank you. So he would come to the track on Tuesday, and he would go back into the truck, and he would start editing that opening piece, and he would edit it to the music. But his theory of television was the announcers complement. The primary thing is the video. So if his idea was, I'm going to put together the best 70 shots that I got. Maybe it'll make sense, maybe not. He would finish that late Wednesday night for the most part, and then he'd hand it to me. And so I would spend like Thursday and Friday almost exclusively working on the script for that, because I had, he didn't have an idea. There it is. He got some pictures, so he would go ahead and write to him. And so I would write to him, and that collaboration I think we turned out some pretty good pieces, and obviously a lot of people do as well, because once I stopped doing them, then on YouTube, if you would search for Delta Force Indy, people have either taken the video or the music, but every time the Delta Force music opened, and they do their own opening for the Indy 500. I saw one for this year just the other day that used my voice, but they changed the pictures. So I got a cult going out here, and that's the greatest form of a compliment,
How was working with Bobby Unser and Sam Posey?
You had to ask that. Bobby Unser, a three-time winner of the 500, was unique. He was an amazing personality, dynamic. You knew when he came into the room. But in a lot of ways, he was also a little humble. But if you're going to talk about racing in the Indy 500, he's the absolute expert. And that's valid. Sam Posey was primarily a sports car racer who I think competed in 2 Indianapolis 500s with no great result. But he was an intellectual type. He lived up in Connecticut. His training was in architecture. He was also an artist, and so he came to it from more of a poetic point of view. And so Bobby, having to enforce his position as the guru, if Sam would say something, it was not uncommon to hear Bobby immediately say, "No, Sam, you're not right." And then he would go ahead and explain what he thought was right. And on many occasions, he would say, "No, Sam, you're not right." And then he'd start talking, and it took him 45 seconds to do it, but he'd talk his way around to saying exactly what Sam had said, but now Bobby Unser had said it, so it's true.
Was it competitive between them? Like, was it?
No, it was. A lot of people thought it was competitive. A lot of people did, but they were very good friends, and they
Yeah.
both love racing, and they talk about all the little nuances of what both had done. Him in sprint cars, and Sam in the sports cars, and I think it amazed everybody. We were flying to Australia, and a lot of racers were on board the aircraft, and Sam and Bobby were sitting together, and they were all watching to see when the fight would break out, 14-hour flight. And the two just talked to each other the whole 14 hours, as friendly as can be.
Did you ever have to play peacemaker off
Yes.
mic?
In fact, Jack Aruda, our pit reporter, gave me a referee striped shirt one year, so I could properly do my job. Yeah, there were occasions when I had to kind of calm them down a little, because they were both trying to make what they felt was their most important point, and it's my job there to keep all of that in balance, and to definitely, it's okay to have an argument. Arguments are kind of fun. Any kind of controversy is fun, but I had to make sure that the race, from an announcer's point of view, that we were being smooth about the coverage of it. So yeah, occasionally it'd be something hopefully subtle, like "shut up." No, what I do is they sat on either side of me, and I just put my hand on both of their shoulders, and that was their indication that they really need to wrap it up.
Did you enjoy having a three-person broadcast?
Oh yeah, so much. I became a very, very close friend with Bobby, with Sam to a slightly lesser degree, but both of them are extraordinarily close friends. Sam's still alive. Bobby, of course, died 2 years ago. And with Bobby away from the track, we could sit here and talk Bobby stories about 3-4 hours easily. He was a unique individual. Just quickly, one of them, we were in Scottsdale, Arizona. I'm driving the rental car. The reason I'm driving it, not the race driver, is because at that particular time Bobby was banned from driving rental cars because he'd abused so many of them. So we're driving along the Camelback Mountain, and there are a bunch of really high-end houses built up on the mountain. And Bobby suddenly says, "Look at those houses, turn in here, we got to go up and see those houses." I mean, Bobby, there's going to be all kinds of security, there are going to be gates, we're not going to get anywhere. But I turned in. And we went about halfway up, and he said, "Oh, turn here, turn here." And I did that, and then he said, "Look at this house." It had a circular drive in front. And so he said, "Pull up in there, pull up on that circular drive." And when I get in front of the door, he yells, "Stop." And he jumps out of the car. Now, I'm pretty sure the police are already on the way. He goes up to the door, knocks on it, and the lady of the house opens the door. And he used one of his standard openings. "Hi, I'm Bobby Unser, 3-time winner of the Indianapolis 500 and the fastest man alive. May I see your house?" She's going to call the police, hit the alarm. No, she said, "No, come in, Mr. Unser." She didn't know him, but she gleefully gave this man a tour of the house. That's the personality that Bobby was.
What was the longest amount of time you were ever on air for a race? Because there's not a halftime or anything like that where you get a bathroom break.
Well, I am proud to report that for one show, not like an Olympics with a bunch of different stuff and everything, I hold the network record of 7 hours and 14 minutes being on the air, and that was 2004. Normally, we were done in like 3 hours and
Yeah.
15 minutes. Yeah. So there was a rain day. It just was back and forth. And then right as the race ended, we had to do the winner's circle with a downpouring rain in the back in the green room under the pagoda. And when the broadcast was done, and I'm coming out of the booth, and I find the place is empty. And the place is empty because there was a tornado alert that we didn't know about. It was on the pylon, basically the pylon was leave now. And Gary Gerald and I met up with one another, and we went over to the catering tent because one of the nice things about doing the 500 was catering had just an enormously great steak dinner after the race. But everybody had evacuated, but Gary and he didn't hear it either. So we looked at each other, we went in, we got our food, sat down, ate it. When the water in the tent was finally up around our ankles, and we said, yeah, let's get out of here. And there were tornadoes that passed through Indianapolis that day.
Yeah. Which Indianapolis 500 had the most memorable finish that you were on the call for, if there's one that sticks out?
Well, certainly Ari Luyendyk over Scott Goodyear by just, I forget that number, but Scott Goodyear finished second twice, and you combine the interval for both times, and it was like 2.4 seconds. I mean, he lost them just by a couple of inches. But when Al Unser Jr. and Emerson Fittipaldi were fighting, here were two of the greatest names in sport. Emerson, of course, with his Formula One background, and little Al is just immensely popular in the U.S. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, the audience has seen these guys all day. The audience knows who they are. What can I add to what we're looking at right now? And I decided nothing. So I just stopped talking. I just let the natural sound, the cheer of the crowd and everything go. The producers in my ear was, "What's wrong up there? Is your mic on?" And I said, "No, just follow me." For once they did. And so I would say things like just maybe every lap I'd pop in, maybe every other lap, and say like, "There are 25 miles to go." And I'd say it mostly in that tenor.
Yeah.
And so when on the last lap, they run into each other up in the north end of the track, now that has all been set up completely, and now I can really jump in and work with it. And I was pretty proud of doing it that way because it went against mostly what we are trained to do.
Do you have a favorite Indy 500 memory?
You mean just in general?
Yeah.
Other than that one at the track?
Yes, in general.
Yeah, that's a tough question because in a way it's, do you have a favorite broadcast memory or you just have a really, really great moment? Elio Castroneves and I were really good friends. And I was in the radio booth. I called his first win on television, but I was in the radio booth for his second win. And as soon as he won, I asked the host player, because there was a new guy, Mark James was going, can I go down there? I want to get down there. And I down from the top of the pagoda and ran to the back of Winner's Circle, which is high, security all over the place. And I wasn't going to try and breach that security, but he saw me, and he comes running to me, and we hugged. I mean, I was so excited. He was. I will tell you that race drivers sweat a lot during the Indy 500, so that was an interesting hug. But I love the guy, and of course he could win an unprecedented fifth Indy 500 this year, and then after that it would be a very long time until you ever saw something like that again.
And what about the obviously you weren't the play-by-play announcer for this, but what about in 2021 also after the coming back after COVID?
Oh, you mean actually being at the race?
Yeah.
Under COVID? Well, I'll tell you about COVID because it's kind of interesting. Speedway had no spectators. Roger Penske footed the bill himself, and it was important because the Indy 500 is where a lot of teams get some funds that will carry them to the end of the season. So if they had just canceled it, a lot of teams would have been in serious trouble. So Roger canceled the spectators, and they were really tight on when you'd come in the track and everything. They were very serious about it. So the day of the race, we find out that we can only have like 4 people in the booth. So, there's a host play-by-play, there's Davey Hamilton, who's the analyst, and there are 2 engineers. So the booth's now full, and I can't go in the booth like I normally would. So I found one of the VIP seats, and I went to it. It was down close to the pit exit, down lower, and I had seldom seen the race from a lower level, and I watched the race from there. Well, but I still had to get on the air. So to get on the air, I'd see what I wanted to comment on, and I would walk out onto the walkway behind that suite, so I had all that race noise ambience going, and I would record on my phone my report. And, it would start with, "Thanks, Mark," and then I'd do it. And then I emailed that to the booth, and they put it on the air when they got it. So that was COVID for us. And the next year to see the crowd just surge back, they were looking, and it was also.
And then Ilya won that year as well, right? 2021.
Right. But the crowds, they're friendly at Indy, which seems to surprise a lot because of the mass of people that are there. But they're there to see a race, have a good time. But when the resurgence in 2021 came, everybody was just so happy that there was an Indy 500, that there was this air of joy among the whole crowd. It really felt good.
What about 2001? You were in Europe for ESPN and the kart series in 2001 when 9/11 happened. What was it like having to call a race just a few days after that?
Well, that's a little bit of a story too. Gary Gerald and I and our wives had flown to Scotland because we wanted to ride on the Royal Scotsman train, which is a 3-night deal. And we had just come back into Edinburgh, and I got my cab, Sally's with me, and the cabbie pulls away and he said, "Did you hear that a plane flew into one of the World Trade Center towers?" And I'm thinking back to when a Mitchell bomber flew into the Empire State Building, that kind of thing, that was, the Empire State Building was, hugely strong. Yeah. And that bomber comparatively wasn't that big. So I'm thinking about that, and I say, "Would you turn the BBC on there?" And that's about the time that the second plane hit. And now I'm realizing this is not some little thing. And so the cab driver rushed us to the hotel. So we turned on the television. Sky Sports, or Sky News was covering it. And the hotel, every U.S. passport holder, they had put a note under the door offering anything that we needed, use of phones or facsimile, whatever. Phone didn't matter. You could dial area code 1 for the United States and it would ring busy immediately. Yeah. So the next day, the 12th, we had to fly to Dresden, Germany. And you talk about security on airplanes. Everybody was hand searched. But we finally got to Berlin, got a rental car, and drove out to Dresden, and arrived there in the evening. And if you remember your history, Dresden was firebombed during the Second World War. So those people had a lot of compassion for us. And there were American flags everywhere, and there was this huge memorial in front of the Hilton. There were others there, but the Hilton was the headquarters hotel, and they knew it. And they were standing out there with candles, and they had a candlelight walk all around the downtown and back. And they treated us so well. So that Saturday, they make the decision that we're going to go live with the IndyCar race from Dresden. And I didn't think that we ought to, but the network thought that we should. So I opened with something about 9/11, and I remember specifically that the word tragedy was being used a lot. And I didn't see it that way. That was an atrocity. And that's exactly why I called it on opening the show. And so when that was over, we couldn't go anywhere because you couldn't fly back to the U.S. And besides, we had another race in England the following weekend, but you still couldn't get home. And so on the company's dime, we kind of hung around London, had a pretty good time until we could finally book a seat back home.
When did you return? Do you remember how long you were in Europe?
We were there 3 weeks.
3 weeks.
Yeah, 3 weeks on a company's dime in London. Diggity dog.
So yeah, it's a benefit. And then that also happened to be the Alex Zanardi crash, I think. Was that same race?
Yeah.
How were the emotions of seeing that happen?
Well, another race car had literally driven through the side of his car. And fortunately, we have a group of doctors that is at every race, and two of them, Steve Albee and Terry Trammell, are now experts in race rescue and that sort of thing. They do stuff everywhere, and they've invented devices to help get the driver out of the car. One of the things is you can't see it, but on the real dashboard behind the steering wheel, there is a big red light, and the onboard computers, including some accelerometers that the drivers have in their ears along with their headphones, can calculate the impact. And if the impact is substantial and the driver might be severely injured because of it, that red light comes on and warns everybody, be a little more careful with this guy. That's what those guys did. And again, your question was
the Alex Zanardi crash.
Oh, thank you. When I saw the crash, I was really worried that it was fatal. But then I noticed the safety team, and specifically Dr. Trammell, were really working vigorously at the car, which they wouldn't have done if it were a fatality. So we knew something was up there, and from seeing the crash, it had to be something horrific. Finally, Trammell pulled his belt off and put a tourniquet around the one leg that he was definitely going to lose, and patched him up as best they could, and they loaded him into the helicopter right behind the garage area to fly him into Berlin. And I still have a vivid picture in my mind of the IndyCar Series priest standing in front of the helicopter and making the sign of the cross. Then the helicopter powered up, and then it powered back down, and they drug him out. He'd actually died, and they had to get better space to work on him. They got his heart going again, put him back in the helicopter, and then up to Berlin. And of course, when the race was over, the whole racing community, we're really a family. All were at the hospital. How's he going to do? He ended up losing his legs, but not his spirit. He had his spirit like you could me. He was a really cool guy. I once apologized that I had not interviewed him as much this particular year, 3 races into the season as we would have in the year before. And he said, "I'm not doing anything. There's no reason for you to interview me, so don't apologize for it." That was him. That was Zanardi.
Obviously, you're most well known for IndyCar, but would you say IndyCar is your favorite sport to call?
Oh yes, by far.
Yeah.
By far. I've done a lot of other sports other than auto racing, but auto racing, IndyCar. I've done Formula One play-by-play, and that was fun. That was a long time ago though, and they had a little more competitiveness than they have now. But yeah, IndyCar by far.
Where does the Nathan's hot dog eating contest?
Oh, come on! You had to do that to me. I did 13 years of the Nathan's hot dog eating contest, and it was only supposed to be 1 year. And it was a couple of guys who were developers on Coney Island who were going to start to build condos, and they were going to rebuild Coney Island. And they, by the way, did it. There are all kinds of great condos. When I was first there, I mean, you were looking around when you walked down the intersection of Surf and Stillwell. The last one I did, the place is just beautiful, ballpark down the way and all that. But it was their idea. We're going to have a race. We're going to, or not a race, a contest, because in 1904 there had been a contest where one guy ate 3 hot dogs in a row or something like that. So they revived all of that with the idea of bringing attention to Brooklyn and to Coney Island. And it was so popular that the next year they had bought it the first year, paid for time and everything, but the next year the network said, "Oh, we're going to do it." That got a very good result, and it became kind of a Fourth of July tradition for everybody before they headed out. And Time magazine once had a picture of President Obama watching it on television, and that's when I knew my career was going to the dogs. But I got a lot of good assignments. General Network here is 32 races or 32 events, and we were only running like maybe 21, 22. So there were other things I had to do. And since my experience with Wide World of Sports and sports anthology programs, I got sent to do things like the Rubik's Cube World Championship in the Opera House in Budapest, and I did sumo wrestling for a number of years. They made me travel to places I probably would never have traveled to myself. And travel is an education.
Yeah.
So I did the America's Cup in 2003 down in Auckland, New Zealand. It gave me a terrific life.
What was your preparation like for something like the Rubik's Cube or even sumo wrestling? Like, is that something that you spent days preparing for, or do you just kind of call it as you see it?
Those things you just have to pour over the books and make all the notes you can, and then you have to go talk to the competitors. Really sit down with them. You're not recording it or anything. Just sit down and talk about whatever, and get a sense of who they are and what's important to them.
Is calling different motorsports? Is it very different? Is calling, or is it all kind of similar?
Motorsports. I mean, I've even done motocross and supercross and snowmobile racing. The essence of it is all pretty much the same. You bolt a motor onto something and you race it against somebody else. The Indianapolis 500 is by far the hardest because there are so many elements that, the fuel load and what the tires are doing, how fast they're wearing, and where everybody else is in the field, what they're doing, what their tactics are. Most of the races are like 250 miles, but Indy 500, so there's 250 miles there. The only one that is that long. So there's that, and all that mixes in to you really need to be on your game to call that one and look at all those variables.
We're coming up on the 30th anniversary of NASCAR racing at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Mm-hmm. What did you think of NASCAR racing there when they went there in '94, and what do you think of NASCAR's legacy there now today?
Well, when they first came there, we were all very, very excited about it. It was an ABC sports show, and I was assigned to it along with Bob Jenkins and Benny Parsons. And it was a totally different audience. They were a really in-the-know audience. That is to say, when I started the show, they had built a little scaffolding up in one of the grandstands. And when I started the pregame, grandstand was virtually empty. And I'm thinking, oh, this thing is just bombed. And so now for half an hour, I'm concentrating on the camera. And when I sign off, we're 15 minutes until the start, and the grandstand was full. And everybody had their clipboards with their stopwatches and everything, and they were into it, and that was a different kind of crowd. Now there still seems to be, or there is now, some controversy. Do we run the road course? Do we run the speedway? and how do the NASCAR drivers feel about it. And I think a lot of them feel that they can't put on a good show on the oval anymore. And so they prefer the road course. But then there's another group who are real traditionalists and say, no, we're at Indianapolis. We got to race that oval.
What makes the Indianapolis 500 so special and unique? Last year, I heard Al Michaels said that the start of the Indy 500 is as exhilarating as anything in sports, and that's Al Michaels saying, who obviously has had as illustrious of a
he'd done
a few things.
And by the way,
with
he
him
and I
that,
are close. We've talked about the 500 quite a bit. What makes it special? First of all, almost 400,000 people coming to the same place. I mean, consider that in the population of a number of cities and where it might fit in. And they're all pretty good. I mean, the traffic in the morning goes for miles, but they get everybody in. Indianapolis probably has the best system for that. They've been doing it that way since 1946. So they're good at that. And then the ceremonies, when you get the Purdue marching band out there, and the ceremonies are very traditional, especially the last 20 minutes before the start. And I just sit there because I'm excited myself. I'm feeling it. I mean, and it's a crescendo. You don't feel it as much on television as you do at the track, because television puts some commercials in and lengthens that out a little. But at the track, one, everybody's on their feet, and when they go just before they start the engines, because it is Memorial Day weekend, they have taps. Honor Guard crew comes out, and when they announce the playing of taps, that crowd goes silent. It's so eerie, because a moment ago it was making all kinds of noise, and it goes silent, and taps rings out, and then maybe a 10-second pause, and the PA announcer will say, something to the effect, and now here at the pace car, Roger Penske, whatever, and gentlemen, start your engines. And now the crowd just goes nuts. They cheer like for 5 or 6 laps. My family says it's sometimes hard to get the people to sit down that's in front of them because they're all excited. But it's that role in that tradition that's so cool.
What is that rush like of knowing so many people, millions of people watching you, but also the 400,000 people, just that sound of the crowd and kind of that rush of energy that you feel even as a broadcaster?
Well, I'm a traditionalist, so it would not be unknown for me to tear up a little when they're doing that, when they're going through back home again in Indiana and the other parts. Just because I've been there since '60, when I was 15 as a spectator. I love that tradition. I love the pacing of it all, and I love the way it builds to a crescendo. And so that's just, for me, believe it or not, it's the same thrill that I had in 1960 when I was first there. I just look so forward to it.
And since we just mentioned it, how did you develop a friendship with Al Michaels?
Well, Al had done the race, of course, for ABC. He was part of that first 2 years crew. And so one of those years he called me and wanted to know some things, how I might approach this or that, and I told him. And we started communicating with one another, and every now and then we'd see each other, unfortunately more often now at funerals because we're all getting up there. And he's funny. He had one year, I want to say maybe 87 or so, and I forget what the thing was, but he had made a joke at the end of Monday Night Football that was, whatever happened was a little bit early to make a joke like he did. He just got creamed on the internet. And I saw him the next night, and we're at a cocktail party, and I walk in, and he comes running across the room. And he's, Paul, they hate me. And he's seriously worried about all of this. And I took him by the shoulders, and I said, Al, don't read the internet. There are a lot of people out there that just put things down just so they get noted. A lot of flamethrowers out there. He kind of was okay with that, but he was still very bothered about it for some time. That was actually our rule. We had a pit reporter named Jan Beekes, really good guy, and he would read the internet, and he'd come in so depressed and all. And so we finally created the Jan Beekes rule, which is you may not read the internet on anything that has to do with motorsports or Facebook on motorsports or whatever. That was the Beekes rule.
Do you know if Al has followed your advice, or if you need to keep reminding him not to read the internet?
I suspect that it was painful enough that he's probably not reading the internet.
Yeah, I think that's usually the better thing to follow. Even I have to read the internet, and I still try to not read it as to avoid it as much as I can. But
right.
Still
good move.
Do you have a last thing? Do you have a favorite part of Indy 500 weekend?
Yeah. I like the night before the 500 when most of the crowd is now in the area, and there is a number of campgrounds and a lot of people at the campgrounds. There's one right across the street from the Speedway, huge. The Speedway runs it, and it's just a really well-run, nice campground. And so I will go out there maybe about 7 o'clock in the evening when it starts getting dark and hang until 10-ish, 10:30, and just be part of that crowd. And as a broadcaster, that gets me into the mood. And, I'm just hearing what they're talking about, who they think's going to win. And so the night before the 500 at the Speedway is and I see so many friends year after year. Again, traditions. They're camped in the same place and just on and on.
Well, Paul, enjoy this weekend. You were great. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
I appreciate that too. And you can imagine how I felt when I realized what the name Awful Announcing. I'm on a list. But it's been a lot of fun. Thank you very, very much.
That is Paul Page. I'm Brandon Contes. This is the Awful Announcing Podcast. Please rate and subscribe to this podcast. Please also subscribe to Awful Announcing's YouTube page. But regardless of how you consume Awful Announcing and the Awful Announcing Podcast, thanks for listening and be good.
Thanks for listening to the Awful Announcing Podcast. For the latest news spanning the sports media landscape and more, check out awfulannouncing.com and follow us at Awful Announcing.